Hi, this is Gayle from Bigfoot Researchers of the Hudson Valley. We're at a meeting tonight, and I'm going to tell you about a recent encounter that was told to Tom and I about a week ago. Two gentlemen came into my shop, and they were, looking around, and they saw this picture in the shop. And they looked at each other and looked at me and said, "That's what we saw." Only the one they saw was lighter color. Maybe it was, they said white or gray. It could have been gray, but they saw one during the day was seen by one of the gentlemen, and then the second one was seen by both of them, and it was at night. And they had bright flashlights, and they hit it with the flashlight. So they were kind enough to write their story up for me. They want to be anonymous, which I can understand that very well, because of, they don't want to have a lot of people going into this area. So I'm just going to say it happened in the Hudson Valley. And it was near the Appalachian Trail. So the first gentleman had his encounter solo, and I'm going to read it for you now. He said, "I was hiking in the Hudson Valley in the fall of 2018. Most of my free time I'm outdoors, usually hiking a couple of days a week, even in the winter snow. Most of the time I hike alone and have never gotten scared during the day. I was hiking all day, and it was a typical day with the ambient nature sounds. But it was early afternoon by now, and all of a sudden the forest just went completely silent, and I had a very eerie feeling. A fear started sweeping over me. There was no rustling, not any white noise. It was the only time I pulled out my bear spray and had it in my hand just in case. I also pulled out my phone and had a camera app opened and the finger over the record button in case something popped out. I had an eerie feeling that there was some predator lurking, most likely a coyote, but there's an occasional bear or even the rumored Sasquatch that I've heard stories of in the region. As I started to round the bend, I froze. I could have sworn I saw a coyote just standing there, and I stared at it for a minute or two, and it didn't move. It was just a stump, I believed, but I was very paranoid and jumpy of every little stump and odd tree shape. Then I started walking again, but kept my gaze on the stump. Then ahead of me, just out of nowhere, popped a white, furry humanoid, and it just glided right across my path, maybe 30 to 50 feet ahead of me. It was about 7 foot tall, but very skinny, not scrawny, but just lean. There was no taper to its body, just very vertical and straight, and it seemed to glide effortlessly as it ran. Even up and down the uneven terrain, it just glided and through leaves and brush with no noise. After a few seconds, it faded off into the woods. Initially, I was in disbelief and just stood there. In this moment, I was in such disbelief that I wasn't really scared yet. Then I realized my finger was over the record button. It was like I wasn't even in my body, and I wasn't thinking of hitting record. Something compelled me to call it back. I stood there for about a minute, trying to contemplate how to call it back. I was still mesmerized. It was so human-like, but I wasn't sure if I should speak English or whistle at it like a dog. Then I just yelled, "Hello." By then, a minute had probably passed by the time I thought of how to say that simple hello, and the creature was most likely a mile away by now. Then I snapped back to reality, and an intense paranoia set back in. I realized that there were probably more of them, and they were probably right behind me. At this point, I was standing in the other one's path where it crossed mine. Now I was scared. So I hurriedly headed back to the car. I couldn't run because I didn't want to turn my back on it. So I walked as fast as I could, and every 2 steps I was looking over the opposite shoulders. The thing glided so fast and it was so silent, even in the fall leaves, that if it wanted to grab me, it could have been on me in the blink of an eye. I covered the mile back to the car pretty quickly. The next few nights were sort of spacing out, and I was too wound up to sleep. I only told a couple of people. After describing it to my one friend, he laughed after I said it was white, and he said, "I saw a unicorn." I got frustrated and told him to come back out with me and I'll show him. So that was the first sighting, and that was near the Appalachian Trail. Okay, so the second sighting was a nighttime sighting. I was petrified of going back, but the frustration outweighed the fear. Eventually, I talked my friend into driving back to the spot. When we got there, he realized that I wasn't kidding. We both ended up going back home. We did that a few times, drove 40 minutes there, and then drove straight back home. Maybe a week or 2 later, we decided we just have to do it and get it over with. So now it was nighttime, and since Sasquatches are supposedly more active at night, we both had bright white flashlights. I figured it would scare every animal out, but I was really determined just to push myself back to the spot and hopefully not see anything, and hopefully just tell myself I hallucinated. We started walking towards where I had my sighting, which was maybe a mile or 2 from the car. I was leading and my friend was right behind me because I was more afraid of what was behind us instead of what I could see ahead of me. We probably didn't even make it a quarter mile before I saw eye shine and paused. It was super out of the ordinary. The eye shine was on the ground like a raccoon, but the eyes were too far apart, like a deer. I've never seen a deer lay their head on the ground though. Usually when they lay down, you see their eye shine a foot or 2 off the ground as they perch up to stare at you. This was right on the ground and big eyes, like a deer. Looked similar to a deer, but something was off, like they were forward pointing and further apart. It was like a light white green, like you'd expect from a deer, but I also had the bright white flashlight that could have contributed to the brightness. Then all of a sudden the eyes disappeared. I thought they just blinked. Then I realized the eyes didn't disappear, but now they were about 10 feet up. It seemed to be some silhouette standing up, but I didn't have a good bead on it yet. Then it took a side step or 2, and it hunched over and galloped down on all 4s down a 15 to 20 foot embankment. I trained the flashlight on it, and it was bright white and wolf looking. It was the size of a Subaru Forester, but just covered with white fur. My flashlight could have made it look whiter than it was, so it could have been a light gray. The tail was huge and fluffy and really stood out to me. And in the fall leaves, it made no sound. It just glided off into the distance. This one was very different from the one that he saw during the day. The thing during the day was 60% human, 30% coyote, and 10% mountain lion. This one was 90% wolf and only 10% human. I researched every wolf species, and even the biggest one doesn't come close. No clue to the weight, but it was dense like a Subaru Forester, covered in fur with a giant tail trailing behind. I again realized that I had my camera and bear spray in my hand, but never hit the record, and it never even occurred to me that I could have used the spray had it charged me. My friend was freaking out, and I felt a little more relieved that someone else saw it and felt safer with someone else there. I don't know what compelled me, but for some reason I whistled for it to come back. Part of me was pulling me towards it into the darkness, but part of me said, don't go. Then I started recording my video, but we never caught another glimpse. My friend was starting to leave, so I was backtracking out with him, but I was also drawn to catch another peek. We made it back to the car, and I believe the car ride was mostly silent, but eventually we tried deciphering what we saw. We worked up the courage to go back several days later during the day and look for evidence. We found several fresh, large impressions and in some old moss, but it was too vague to tell if they were wolf or human-like. Okay, that was witness A, and now his friend, witness B, tells his story of that encounter. It was late fall night in 2018, dark and rainy, ground covered in leaves. My friend and I arrived at a hiking spot in the Hudson Valley. We started our hike, each of us with a flashlight. I was behind him. About 15 minutes into the hike, my friend stops when he sees two eyes glowing, reflecting the light of his flashlight beam atop a high rock formation about 50 to 60 feet ahead of us. Suddenly, this creature stands up on its hind legs. At this point, we both trained our flashlights on it. Then, quickly, but without making a sound, it leaps onto all fours, jumping off the boulder it had been perched upon. It started to dart in our direction, but then turned, and in a few leaps ran into the darkness where we lost sight of it. It was huge, with fluffy white or light gray fur and a bushy tail like a fox, but its size was much larger, like an SUV. Even though there were leaves on the ground, it didn't make a sound. My friend wanted to chase after it, but I wanted to get the hell out of there. We ran back down the trail to the car and left in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what we just saw. Thank you.